In a world dominated by capitalism, the fact is war's not about nationalism or what television tells you to believe in. It ain't about security, it's not about freedom. It's about conquering resources, expanding an empire that's corporate, so industrial profits remain hoarded. A few rich elite people are rewarded. These individuals don't report to the government cause it's a revolving door where laws and policies are basically forged to benefit the rich while the poor are ignored. And to understand this is important. Out of war, a small group makes a fortune. Regardless of its inhumanity, it's actually wanted by industry, cause it's the most lucrative thing that can happen. And international bankers always cash in, forcing countries to borrow more and more money just to support their wars. The bottom line is more profit is made the longer that a war can be sustained. They're supposed to be long and go on, and believe it or not, they're not meant to be won. Look at history, you'll see events are staged within the government, then someone else is blamed. Public perception is manipulated to support agendas that before we were against. This is all done through the mass media, cause people believe what TV feeds to us. There's no real enemy in a war on terror, so what that means is it can go on forever.
Men do not easily assume the task of opposing their government's policy, especially in time of war.
I am asking your help in the tremendous task of informing and alerting the American people.
What if war and preparation for war is a racket? What if the American people woke up and understood that the official reasons for going to war are almost always based on lies and promoted by war propaganda in order to serve special interests?
At the time that World War II began, Franklin Roosevelt was the U.S. president, and his family were bankers who wanted in the war because for them nothing else could make them profit more. The plan was to provoke the Japanese to fire the first shot and become the enemy. So Roosevelt did everything he could to spark anger, supporting China, Japan's enemy neighbor. And several days before Pearl Harbor was hit, the president was told of oncoming battleships by Australian intelligence, but he ignored this, resulting in the death of 2,400 soldiers. 80% of the public was against going to war just before this event. Then 1 million men volunteered for action. This was no sneak attack, it was allowed to happen. And when the Vietnam War began, the president of the States was Lyndon Johnson. Again, the U.S. knew it could make a profit if they had an excuse to enter the conflict. In 1964, they alleged Vietnamese boats attacked 2 U.S. ships. This apparently occurred in the Gulf of Tonkin. It's the reason why their military was called in. There's one problem, however. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara spoke out years later and stated this attack never occurred in the first place. It was a mistake, it was a complete lie. Over 3 million people died, and this is not a conspiracy thing they're trying to hide. You can read it for yourself, it's all declassified.
Either you are with us, or you are with the terrorists.
Of course we're after Saddam Hussein, bin Laden. You know, one of the hardest parts of my job is to connect Iraq to the war on terror.
There is no doubt that Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction.
We know where they are. They're in the area around Tikrit and Baghdad.
The main reason we went into Iraq at the time was we thought he had weapons of mass destruction. Turns out he didn't. What did Iraq have to do with what?
The attack on the World Trade Center.
Nothing.
Did you know, in order to gain power, Hitler burned down his own Parliament Tower? Then he blamed terrorists for the attack, and within weeks passed the Enabling Act. This destroyed the German Constitution. When it came to rights, people had to lose them and support his program of war and tyranny, all deemed necessary for homeland security. Sounds like something else. It's interesting how history repeats itself. Makes you wonder if 9/11 may have been planned to jumpstart wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Terrorism's not the threat that we're led to believe it won't cause our death. It's just propaganda used to make you afraid so the government can go to war and take our rights away. Dick Cheney, the vice president, was also the CEO of Halliburton, and that's the same company that got contracts worth billions of dollars to rebuild Iraq. This is why the Middle East was invaded, so they could steal the oil and dominate it, establish permanent military bases to be used against other oil-bearing nations. In terms of profit for the elite, see death and destruction's a positive thing, and a global monopoly's what they seek over the energy resources that we all need. It's no different than the...
I'm talking about the real owners now. The real owners, the big wealthy business interests that control things and make all the important decisions. Forget the politicians. The politicians are put there to give you the idea that you have freedom of choice. You don't. You have no choice. You have owners. They own everything. They own all the important land. They own and control the corporations. And they own all the big media companies, so they control just about all of the news and information you get to hear. They spend billions of dollars every year lobbying to get what they want. Well, we know what they want. They want more for themselves and less for everybody else. But I'll tell you what they don't want. They don't want a population of citizens capable of critical thinking. They don't want well-informed, well-educated people capable of critical thinking. They're not interested in that. That doesn't help them. That's against their interest. That's right.
So welcome back to Roxanne and Robin's podcast, episode 21, with our very special guest, Mark Devlin. DJ who plays conscious music, a public speaker with talks on all sorts of subjects, particularly exposing the truth about the music industry and the ways in which the powers that should not be control the masses and change culture through mind control and subliminal messaging. Mark Devlin, it's an absolute pleasure to have you with us today. Thanks for joining us.
No worries, Robin. Good to be on with you. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, no worries. And sorry, Roxanne couldn't be with us, but, you know, as life gets challenging sometimes
That's
with diaries. Yeah, I think all three busy people, we've done well to get two of us on. So we just played The Facts of War Part 2 by Cale Sampson. And this is part of one of your sets. So before we get to know you a bit more, you mentioned Cale recently. Why don't you just give us some insights about him?
Yeah, so I came across Cale Sampson several years ago. I think it's about 2013. And he's just put out this one album from which that track is taken. He's an awesome lyricist. He's just a regular dude by his own admission. And he's someone that woke up to the whole truth-seeking process, you know. And he had the gift of being able to put all this stuff to lyrics, to poetry, basically, or what you might call rap. So he put out this one album and just expressed himself brilliantly on all these tracks. And I got onto it straight away and just loved the material. So I've been busting that on my conscious music podcasts, and I've been playing his tracks at my live gigs as well. So I played that track at an Acapulco in Mexico. Yes. I did a couple of pool party DJ sets there, and I dropped that track, and people were flocking up to the DJ booth to ask who it was. People were saying, "This is incredible. Who is this guy?" And so I relayed this to Cale himself. And I said, you know, your track is getting a lot of love out there, man. And he's very humble about it. You know, he does a day job. He's just a regular guy. He doesn't see himself as an artist. And I said, your stuff is incredible. You know, you need to do more of this. Yes. And he said he doesn't actually have any plans to put out another album. So everything is just resting on this material that he has put out. Now, I'm going out to Toronto in October for a quick trip, and I've arranged to meet him there. Okay. So I'm going to link with him and hopefully record a quick interview and try and persuade him to get back in the studio and do more of this stuff, because it's very impactful.
Oh, please do, because we absolutely love the track. We played it once a few weeks back on one of our podcast episodes, and everyone in chat was asking, when we premiered it later on YouTube, everyone was asking, who's this song?
There you go.
We'll link it up again in the show notes for everyone to catch that tune again. So thanks for spotting him, Mark, because it was your an Acapulco set that I heard it from.
Sure. I think he might be missing his calling in life there, which is why I'm going to try and persuade him very forcefully to do some more of it.
Good for you. Well, I encourage anyone else to do the same. Reach out to him and encourage him to make some more. So for those that are joining you new today, Mark, why don't we start, just give people a bit of context, where you've come from, a little bit about your background, what brought you into this realm of truth telling, as it were, and sharing the truth publicly.
Sure. Well, I've been a radio and club DJ for almost 30 years. Next year, it will actually be 30 years. So I started out on a radio station in Oxford, which is where I was born, and did some backroom tasks as a T-boy and a general dog's body, and then got into the programming side of radio and got very interested in music programming. And from that, I became a club DJ. I really wanted to communicate my enthusiasm for music to other people, It's the main reason why anyone becomes a DJ, basically, because they love music themselves and they want to evangelize for the stuff that they love and to get other people as enthusiastic as they are. So that got me on the path to becoming a DJ. It wasn't easy. It was a very arduous path to get started, but I ended up being reasonably successful in my field, playing black dance music. So I played R&B, hip hop, soul, funk, disco, reggae, that sort of stuff. And I carved out a career for myself for a number of years. I was fortunate enough to travel to many different countries to play gigs, and I did radio shows and wrote for music magazines. And that was my life up until about 2010. And if you'd asked me up to that point what my identity was in the world, I'd have said, well, I'm a DJ. That was what I considered myself to be. And I imagined that I'd be doing it for the rest of my adult life. But in 2010, I underwent a process whereby I came to some realizations about what this world really is and what's going on here, who really runs things, which is not the people and the institutions that we're told run things. So it's not governments, it's not these corporations that we see in the mainstream. I realized that when you get down to it, we're looking at secret society networks, we're looking at dark occultists, we're looking at people and groups that keep themselves in the shadows, but actually direct every aspect of our lives, of human society, organized society. So I threw myself into researching all of this. It was basically the books of David Icke that got me started back in 2010. That's what got me on this whole path. But then I started to look at other researchers, and I realized that so much of what they were all saying cross correlates and backs that they back up each other's information. And so I started weaving together this tapestry of knowledge in my mind, and this was an ongoing process, as it is for anyone. But my life changed at that point. And by the time 2011 had come around, I realized that so much of my life up to that point had been a lie. I'd been living under deception, under mind control. I wasn't happy about it. I never appreciated discovering that I've been mugged off.
Sure.
And I always seek to find out how it was done when I realized that has been the case. And so my life over the past nearly 10 years has been very different to the way it was before. What I was especially interested in was discovering how the music industry, of which I'd been a part, is involved in this whole process of mind control and slavery, basically human slavery, because that's what we're looking at here. And so that became my special area of interest. And studying what the music industry is really used for at a corporate level led to the publication of my two books, Musical Truth Volumes 1 and 2. And I've since done a whole bunch of public talks on these subjects, and I've done a load of radio interviews, and this has become my life, which I never imagined it would, but it's taken over from everything else. The DJing stuff has been pushed by the wayside. That's no longer my career. I do a few gigs here and there, but I now do a separate day job just to pay the bills, because partly the industry and the music scene that I was involved with has changed so much that it's no longer possible to carve out a decent living from it unless you truly want to sell your soul and truly want to prostitute yourself to the corporations that run these things. But also my conscience would no longer allow me to be a part of what I was before, because the music is straight garbage. The music that I was involved with has degenerated and degraded to such a degree that it's now satanic, mind-controlling garbage. And I make no bones about referring to it as that. So I cannot be a part of that anymore in all good conscience, because this is the stuff that I now expose through my work. So I can't be a part of it, putting it out there. Not that I want to any longer, but this is where I'm at in life now, telling the truth about what these scenes are really being used for.
Which brings us up to this very day, the 31st of July, where you're in Bristol, which is my hometown, and I will be coming to see you. To tell people about that event. I mean, by the time we get the podcast out, it will have come and gone, but delighted to say that I'll be coming to see you.
Sure. Look forward to seeing you there. Well, tonight I'm doing the latest installment of a talk that I've been taking out on the road called Occult Aspects of the Beatles. and the McCartney conspiracy. So I've done many public talks over the years exposing different aspects of the corporate music industry and the entertainment industry generally. And this incorporates things like lifetime actors, celebrities that are put up there on a pedestal in the public eye, specifically to have an influential and controlling effect on the public mindset. I've gone into many different aspects of how that works. I've looked at different genres within the music industry, electronic dance music, hip hop, what that's become, the rock scene, the psychedelic rock scene coming out of the 60s, Laurel Canyon and all that stuff, the heavy metal scene. But what I'm focusing on specifically in this talk tonight is the Beatles, because of all the groups and all the acts that have been put across the radar of the general public over the decades, there is none as fascinating and captivating as the Beatles. It's an amazing story. You could make a full-time career just out of researching the Beatles and the many subtleties and nuances of that particular group. So I'm looking tonight at suggestions that the Beatles were anything but a natural, organic, grassroots act, anything but four regular working class lads from Liverpool who just happened to put together a band, write a few catchy songs, come up with a few great guitar riffs, and against all the odds, strike a major record company deal and go on to become the most influential group in the history of modern culture. Well, I'm suggesting that this kind of process does not happen on your own terms as a band. And the only way that you can achieve those levels of success is if your career is made to happen for you by the organizations that can put these sort of things into effect. So I'll be presenting a whole load of evidence to suggest that the Beatles actually came from Freemasonic backgrounds. That they have connections with the secret society network that runs the music industry, and that all along their career has been steeped in occult symbolism. There's much evidence to show that this is the case, and I'll be showing some of the symbolism, some of the imagery, some of the motifs that have been used in their artwork over the years. Also, I'm incorporating the McCartney replacement conspiracy. Which I want to pick your brains on that. Go ahead. Yeah, it makes many people groan the first time they hear it, because a lot of people reject this idea out of hand. My own stance has changed on it somewhat over the years I've been researching it. So I remember first coming across the suggestion that the real Paul McCartney died in 1966 and was replaced by an imposter that's been playing the public role ever since. Back in the 80s, when I was at school, some kid came into school one day with a copy of Abbey Road, I think, the album with the zebra crossing, the famous iconic sleeve. And he said, there's this conspiracy theory that Paul McCartney is really dead because he's walking barefoot across this zebra crossing in a loosely fitting suit. And I remember at the time thinking how ridiculous that was. And, how can a guy walking across a zebra crossing with no shoes mean that he's dead? And I put it to the back of my mind. But when I started getting into all this music industry research, it came back across my radar. And I remembered hearing about it. So I thought, well, I'd better look into this and research it and see if there's any grounds to it, And so I got caught up in the whole world of what is known as PID, Paul is dead. And this research area maintains that McCartney did indeed die in 1966. The circumstances differ according to which researcher you speak to, but the general consensus is that it was some kind of ritual slaying, and that he was taken out deliberately, and that he was replaced by this guy. The main candidate is an individual by the name of William Shepherd. He's sometimes called William Campbell. His nickname is Billy Shears, and we were introduced to him in the Sgt. Pepper album of 1967, when in the lyrics of the opening song they say, "May I introduce to you the one and only Billy Shears." So there's so many clues that are supposed to have been placed in Beatles artwork, album sleeves, in the recordings themselves, in lyrics, in backmasked messages, in things that the Beatles have said in interviews, cryptic comments that they've made in public. So in my first book, I detail all of this in a 15,000 word chapter documenting the whole history of the Paul is dead thing. Then as time moved on, I started to look at other takes on this situation. And while there are many researchers that will maintain that it was a straight switch and that the real Paul died in 66 and we've not seen him since, there are many researchers who will say that actually what we've been looking at over the years is 2 or more individuals being wheeled out in public and playing the public role of Paul McCartney. So it's not the case that we've had just one guy all these years. And I can say that with a certain amount of, assurance.
Okay. So
what I think we've been looking at is at least 2 and probably more than 2 individuals passing themselves off as Paul McCartney. And as ridiculous as that might sound, when you actually look at the evidence, and we're all supposed to be critically minded truth seekers, right? We're all supposed to go where the information takes us. We're not supposed to have any over attachment to belief systems and ulterior motives and vested interest in things. We're supposed to go where the information takes us. And when you actually look at photographic and video evidence and also pictorial symbolic clues with an open mind, most people, I think, would have to concede that there's been more than one Paul McCartney over the years. So I think it's probably not a question of a straight switch in 66. I think it's more complex than that. I think it's more of a mind F than that. I think it's more of a psyop than that. But it's pretty clear to me that we've had more than one Paul McCartney, and I'll be presenting some of that in the talk tonight.
Amazing. And I do remember a very poignant statement from John Lennon when he said the world has been run by maniacs for maniacal ends.
Right.
And I wonder if he actually felt trapped in the music industry, knowing that he was under strict, tight control. What are your thoughts on that? Like how much they knew, how much they really wanted to be involved, do you think?
We can only speculate on it, but my own personal feeling is that the Beatles were stooges. I don't think they were in control of their careers.
Okay.
People, fans will argue that they were, but I think they were absolutely at the control of Brian Epstein, their manager, George Martin, their producer, who had a very major influence on the way the group evolved, particularly when they went into their psychedelic alternative flower power era from 66 onwards. But there would have been other forces controlling the Beatles as well.
Sure.
And a very common idea is that they were a product of the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations in London, which is a think tank which is concerned with social engineering and mind controlling the masses. It's a military intelligence grade operation that works in tandem with MI6 and other parties as well. From what I've seen, it seems very probable that the Beatles were caught up in the Tavistock Institute because they played a very pivotal role in the social engineering of the 1960s in terms of major changes to society that were happening in the US at the same time as the UK. So you can look at the arrival of the hippie flower power scene in California and the arrival of huge quantities of LSD on the scene. At the same time that the music was all changing and becoming psychedelic rock and folk rock, and you had all these music festivals like the Monterey Pop and Woodstock and Altamont. When you look at what was happening on British shores at exactly the same time, you had the counterculture scene coming out of London of the 60s, Carnaby Street, the swinging 60s, all of this, the avant-garde art scene of the 60s. And the Beatles played into all of that. So while you had psychedelic groups like Pink Floyd starting to emerge, and Tyrannosaurus Rex and Status Quo even in their early days made very psychedelic music, and Small Faces and groups like this, the Beatles' music changed very much from what it was in the early days. When they first emerged, they were basically a boy band, when you think about it, making very straightforward, simple love songs. But by the time 1966 had come around, their music, their image, their ethos, everything they represented had changed. They'd started to embrace LSD culture. Yes. Sgt. Pepper, the album, was deeply psychedelic. It was deeply occult. And there were all kinds of stuff encoded into it. So I feel the Beatles were being used for a role. And I don't feel that the four lads themselves were in control of the situation.
That's
they
an
were
interesting...
being directed, they were being controlled.
That's a fascinating observation, because you could argue a bit like the internet was unleashed to give freedom of thought, freedom of expression, and then they get hijacked and weaponized later on when some forceful power has created a positive message, a bit like Bob Marley. You think, how can they undermine a musician who's now giving such a positive message? And another name that comes to mind was Jim Morrison from the States. Who did you have any thoughts on him during the 70s? He was very much encompassing that same kind of hippie psychedelic movement as well.
Well, he's said to have died in July 1971, so he didn't see much of the 70s. But whether he actually died in 1971 is open to conjecture. Mm-hmm. I personally have my doubts about whether that was a genuine death. When it comes to Jim Morrison, he was, all the research bears out, a lifetime actor. He was someone that was born into one of these important bloodline families, whereby these people are given roles in society. These roles are handed to them, and the intention is for them to have an influence on the public mindset. Jim Morrison is a classic case. The research of Dave McGowan in his book Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, when he looked into the whole Laurel Canyon scene coming out of Los Angeles in the mid to late 1960s, showed that Jim Morrison's dad was Admiral George Stephen Morrison, and he was the guy that was in charge of the fleet of ships involved in the Gulf of Tonkin incident that springboarded America into the Vietnam War.
Amazing.
And yet you've got the Admiral's son, Jim, being put out there as this anti-establishment, anti-war, counterculture icon that is supposed to be a voice for all the youthful angst of those times. And he's supposed to be this iconic rock god that people look up to and place up there on a pedestal. It's classic social engineering, because when you strip away who Jim really was before he emerged as this larger than life rock icon, and we all think of these famous pictures of him with the long hair, with his shirt off in that photo shoot, just looking every bit this icon of those times. Earlier on, he did commercials for a university in Florida. He appeared in this ad, which you can actually see on YouTube, where he's looking all scholarly and collegiate in his blazer, and he's going into this principal's office in this university, and he's doing this commercial for this academic institution in Florida, because that was an acting role that he was given at the time. Later on, his acting role becoming Jim Morrison, the rock god, and by 1971, that role was done. So he played a very major part through his group, The Doors, in ushering in psychedelic rock music, ushering in these anti-war sentiments, the counterculture ethos of the times. But all along, I feel, and the evidence is all there, he was an actor. And he came out of one of these families. So what you find time and time again is when you look at the fathers of these prominent musicians and other cultural influences, the dad comes out of the world of the military or military intelligence or politics. He's an admiral, he's a general, he's a governor, he's a statesman, he's a diplomat, he's a college lecturer. These are very unlikely backgrounds, actually, for fathers of what are supposed to be gritty, grassroots, working class musicians to have. I've made the point so many times that I would expect the fathers of musicians like Jim Morrison and the guys from the Beatles and all these other counterculture icons to have been laborers, builders, dockers, lorry drivers, this kind of thing. You never find that. What you do find is that the fathers are expressions of the establishment. And what you find when you go further back into the family tree and you get into the ancestry is that it's a generational thing. And these people have cropped up in public roles generation after generation. So you might have a Lord Mayor in one generation. In the next generation, the guy is going to work for the CIA. And in the next generation, he's going to be a prominent musician. And there's no shortage of these examples, trust me. So what we're looking at is a dynamic where these people are put into the public eye. They don't work really hard to get there. They don't get there under their own steam. They're given these careers because their families come from these institutions that make these things happen because they control every aspect of organized society.
Mark, you've kind of destroyed one of my boyhood icons of Jim Morrison, but I love the music. And there was a very powerful moment in a Vietnam War film. It's Marlon Brando, Riders on the Storm is the track. I can feel it now being weaponized in that context, i.e., let's all rage against the machine. Here's the hippie movement.
Was it Apocalypse Now?
That's the one. Yeah. A very violent film, very powerful film. But Jim Morrison became more of an icon in my mind as I was a teenager growing up in the 70s with that. But I'd much rather know the truth, to be honest, Mark. And when I hear this as a personal thing,
well, exactly.
I want to know what's really going on. So now sort of moving forward into the noughties, we talked about hip hop, and my kids were growing up then. I had two teenagers in that noughties era. And I remember there was complete vacuous music industry at that point. We maybe had Queen, Tina Turner, U2, and we'll cover perhaps U2 in a minute. But then it was a mixture of there was Blur and Pulp in the UK and Oasis. I could get on with maybe some of those bands, but then we had all this hip hop, and I remember thinking, what such a low energy tracks these are giving my teenage kids, but they just mopped it up like sponges, and they're still into hip hop today. So give us your take on the hip hop industry through that period, and who the key players were and what was going on at the time in this power struggle or this social engineering.
Sure. Well, I drank the hip-hop Kool-Aid in the 90s because I lapped it all up then. And to be fair, the quality of the output in the 90s was not just streets ahead, but continents ahead of what came in the noughties. The 90s is still a classic decade. And I realized that manipulation and control and subversion was going on the whole time. But still, the quality of the output from 1990 up to about 97, 98 was bloody good stuff. And, I still enjoy listening to it now, even though I realized the music was contrived. But what came afterwards in the early 2000s bore no resemblance whatsoever to what had come before. So the corporations were really doing a number on that particular music genre, and it's only degenerated and debased and got more and more further down into the cesspit as the century has progressed. So what kids are listening to in 2019 is nowhere near as good as what they were listening to in 2005. But what they were listening to in 2005 wasn't a patch on what they were listening to in 1998. So it's just getting worse and worse and worse. And to my mind now, what's going into what is described as hip hop, I don't even call it that anymore. I don't even refer to myself as a hip hop DJ anymore because people get the wrong idea about it. They listen to the sort of stuff that you hear on One Extra or Capital Extra or Kiss FM, and they think that's what hip hop is. It's not. I call it demonic sonics. That's a term that I've coined myself, because what I hear going into these tracks is really bad, harmful sound frequencies and production methods that actually make me feel ill. And I've looked a bit into the science of sound and the weaponization of sonics, of sound frequencies, because most people know that sound can be used for healing. It can be used for very positive, uplifting purposes. But the opposite is obviously also true. If in the hands of somebody that wishes to do harm to large groups of people, sound can be a very powerful weapon. Yes. And that's what's being done with this so-called hip hop and, so-called urban music. You've got this terrible, dreadful, preposterous production method called auto-tune, which has been in place for several years now. And that's where they plug a human voice into some software in the studio that makes it sound like a robot. It makes it sound completely artificial and inhuman. This is all a part of normalizing the AI transhumanist smart grid Internet of Things society that we now have. It's part of subliminally entraining young people to accept that technology is great and artificial intelligence is the future. That's why all the music, so-called music they're listening to, has voices with auto-tune all over it. But again, when you just look at the frequencies themselves and study how it makes you feel, I think people of our generation, Robin, because we remember better times, better days, better music, we've got something to compare today's output to. And we realize that things have debased and degenerated. But for a 16, 18-year-old listening to all this stuff that's around at the moment, they've got no point of reference.
Yes.
And even if people of our generation tried to get them to listen to some music from the 90s, they're just going to see that as crusty and old and boring, because now is where it's at. This is their generation. This is their sound. This is their music. So you can look at teenagers, kids now, and the way they react to all this stuff, and they treat it like it's just normal. It's just music. It's just what people listen to. But people of our age, of our generation, really feel the harmful effects of this stuff, because we realize it's so different to what came before. Yeah. So when I hear this stuff now, if I'm unfortunate enough to walk into a shop or something and it's playing, or it comes on the radio, I panic, because it genuinely makes me feel ill. I feel there's really bad stuff going into the sound frequencies. I wouldn't underestimate the idea that spells and demonic forces can be conjured up within the sound frequencies of a track in the hands of some kind of sonic sorcerer that knows what they're doing. And I think that's why people like us can feel it and can detect it, because we know there's something there that shouldn't be. And this is a consequence of everything now being done electronically and digitally, because stuff can be slipped under the radar. When it comes to electromagnetic frequencies and things like the smart grid, Internet of Things, where everything's communicating with each other wirelessly, all the Wi-Fi networks we now have, and the 5G networks that are coming in, the key thing about how they're being slipped under the radar is that you can't see them. There's nothing there to visually indicate that they're in place. And so it is with these electronic digital sound recordings that we now have. You can't detect stuff that may have been stripped in. So when you look at, for instance, the MP3 encoding process that we now have, which is where you can take a large audio file and stick it through a piece of software that turns it into an MP3, what's actually happening is the program is stripping away a whole load of sound frequencies and data that is imperceptible to the human mind and the human ear. So it turns a very large file into a much smaller file, because it's got rid of a load of the information. It's got rid of some of the bass line, it's got rid of some of the instrumentation, but it's done it in a very subtle way, so that when you then listen to the resulting MP3, your mind is not aware of everything that's been taken out. You don't notice it. So if you can take stuff out without people noticing, you can also strip stuff in without people noticing, without them knowing it's there. And I feel that's what's going on with a lot of this so-called music now, which is why to us it sounds so demonic and so horrific, and it just makes us want to reach for the off button. But for very naive kids who, again, have no point of reference and have been trained to think of this stuff as really great, as the voice of their generation, is doing all this harm to them under the surface. But you can't tell them about it. They're not hearing it because they think this stuff is great, because they've been conditioned to think that it's great.
That's really insightful, Mark. Have you heard of the is it the frequency 432, which is supposed to be an empowering frequency, and then there's another frequency? Can you explain a bit about that if you're aware of it?
Yeah, so this is 440 versus 432 hertz. Okay. And any musicologist or audiophile or sound producer or accomplished musician will tell you that 432 is a natural frequency for music to be pitched to. So what I mean by that is it all refers to the A note when you're tuning musical instruments. So A equals 432 hertz. So you tune the A note to 432, and then all the other notes and all the other aspects of that composition fall into line with that. 432 is the bass pitch.
Yes.
So for several decades now, 440 has been the industry standard that's been used for musical instruments to be pitched to and for recorded music to be pitched at, where everything else falls in accordance with 440. So these same sound scientists will tell you that 440 is actually a very discordant frequency. It doesn't sit well with human brain waves, with the rhythm of the human body, with the rhythm of creation itself. It works in discordance with all of that. Whereas 432 is a very natural harmonic frequency that sits very well with the frequency and the vibration of creation itself. So it's the natural choice. So it speaks volumes that the corporations, and it was actually the Rockefeller Foundation, when you get down to it, that campaigned and saw to it that 440 got introduced as the industry standard of doing things.
What a surprise.
Those nice people at the Rockefellers, I shouldn't call them people really, that saw to this. And this perplexed musicologists at the time, because 432 had always been used by musicians up to that point, and everyone was agreed that that was the natural way of doing things. But what we've had for several decades now is 440. It is possible to still tune instruments to 432 if the will is there to do that, and recordings do exist where the music has been pitched to 432. But in the vast majority of cases, when you're getting music played on the radio, or you're going out to buy a CD from one of these corporate record labels, or you're going to a gig, a live concert by one of these corporate-owned acts, you're listening to music that's being delivered at 440, and it's not good. It doesn't sit well with us.
So the onslaught is all pervasive and very insidious, isn't it? It's really, really not there and announced, but unless you become aware of it.
That's right.
So so bring us. I want to touch on a couple of other subjects, which is the symbolism in music videos and some of the visuals that come with music. We're very much aware that the big events of the decade are the Olympics, the Oscars, the Super Bowl, the Brits, and all of those things. Can you give us an insight on what's going on in those ceremonies, particularly with the music?
Yes, even the Eurovision Song Contest now, for God's sake. This year, that was just a complete occult ritual, basically, sigil fest, with Madonna doing her thing, coming out with the patch over one eye, calling herself Madam X now, doing this song that has a jolly, sprightly reggae beat to it. But when you look at the lyrics, it's talking about population reduction and eugenics and getting rid of undesirable aspects of society. So that was all over the Eurovision Song Contest, which used to be innocent enough, it seems. I'm old enough to remember Bucks Fizz and the Brotherhood of Man and all this, and it was just some cheesy bloody pop show, but even that's become very dark now, and it's doing its bit in programming the mass consciousness. So you got the US Super Bowl show and the Grammys and the MTV Music Awards and all this, as you mentioned, and now it's joined by this and pretty much every other major show that you get, particularly the Olympics of 2012. And what's happening is you're just getting all this occult ritualistic symbolism dumped into the subliminal mindset of the general public. Most people don't realize it's happening because it's all done under the guise of entertainment. When you think you're watching entertainment, you think you're taking in one of these shows, you think you're going to a gig of your favorite band, your favorite musician, you think you're just watching some innocent pop video, you think you're watching some Hollywood movie or some TV show, you don't realize that you're being mind controlled and entrained in how to think about certain things. You're having your belief systems and your values and even your prejudices dictated for you, all in the confines of the subconscious mind. It's very powerful what goes on there. The conscious mind is only aware of a very small part of what our minds are taking in at any given time. The rest of it gets lodged straight in the subconscious, and that gets drawn on in the form of dreams. So it comes through many times in what we dream, but also we access what we've lodged away into the subconscious mind through the course of the average day. And as I say, it dictates the way we think about things, and we have no idea it's going on. And we particularly have no idea that we've absorbed all this stuff through watching one of these pop music shows or watching a video or whatever. So they've been absolutely bombarding the public with this stuff over the past few years. Actually, they've been doing it forever. They've been doing it since the very start of the popular music industry. You could take it all the way back to Elvis Presley and Bill Haley and the Comets back in the 1950s and trace the process forward from that point. But they've really stepped up the agenda in the past few years during the 2000s.
Amazing.
If people want to understand the nature of the subliminal messages that are getting put into these videos, they really should take a look at Vigilant Citizen, vigilantcitizen.com. It's a really great website, really great resource to understand what all these symbols are. They look so innocent. They all come with cover stories. So when you see somebody doing this, you think they're saying, okay, everything's cool. But there's another interpretation of that, which is it's an evocation of the number 666, which is a very important number to occultists who run these industries. Then you have this sign getting done. And this is supposed to mean rock and roll, baby. Yeah, it's just supposed to be what rockers do to greet each other, you know. And certainly it goes on within that genre, but that has other connotations as well. Another evocation of it is that it's supposed to mean when the thumb is outstretched like this, I love you, believe it or not. In deaf sign language, it's supposed to be an I, an L, and a U. But this is actually a calling card for Satanists.
Sure.
And other occultists who revere this entity known as Baphomet, and also the horned god known as Pan from the ancient pagan world. So these signs are very far from innocent. And then you have artists covering one eye and, giving us an evocation of one eye in some way or another. So they'll be covering an eye with a hat or with their hair, or they'll be appearing in shadow in a promotional picture, so you just get one eye.
Yes.
There's all kinds of meanings here. It's referring to the Eye of Providence, the Eye of Horus, which you get within Freemasonry and ancient Egyptian symbology, and you get it in other occult circles as well. So people might like to ask themselves why it is that all these artists flash up these symbols every time a camera is in sight. And it's not even just pop artists. You see footballers do it. You can see footballers, when they score a goal, they'll flash up one of these symbols, or they'll do the pyramid hand sign coming out of Freemasonry. So they're letting you know who owns them. They're letting you know who they represent. And I think in a lot of cases, these celebrities have been mind control programmed into doing this. So they're not even consciously aware that they're doing it. It's just second nature to them because they've been programmed to flash up these symbols the whole time.
For those that have done any research into this symbology and the musical industry, we've heard people like, was it Mark Bolan of T-Rex? Was it Mark Bolan? No, it wasn't. It was Katy Perry. There's a handful of others saying you have to make a deal with the devil to get.
They've sold their souls.
Yeah,
they've actually said this in their own words. Bob Dylan famously did an interview where he said he'd sold his soul to the chief commander of this world and of the world we can't see. Katy Perry has made comments like that. Taylor Swift has made comments like that. Beyonce, Rihanna, Ozzy Osbourne, David Bowie, Elton John, the Rolling Stones. They've all made comments pertaining to having sold their soul for fame and fortune. Now, people might think they're just being symbolic. People might think they're just being witty. They're just saying it for effect. But when artist after artist is telling you that they've done this, and when all the evidence bears this out, you look at the stuff that they've been pushing in their lyrics, the stuff that they've been pushing in their images and in their symbolism, and you look at some of the dark stuff that happens behind the scenes with these groups. Look at the history of the Rolling Stones. Look at what they've been into, from the death of Brian Jones to the very strange death of Mick Jagger's girlfriend, Lorenz Scott, just the other year, to some of the stuff that the Rolling Stones have pushed, from Mick Jagger's androgyny to their song Sympathy for the Devil. to the occult rituals and the witchcraft that they were into with Anita Pallenberg and Marianne Faithfull, and their association with Kenneth Anger, a well-known satanic filmmaker. You know, that's just the Rolling Stones. That's before you get into David Bowie and Elton John and Ozzy Osbourne and all these other acts. Everywhere you look, there are connections going into Satanism and the world of the dark occult. Look at Jimmy Page of Led Zeppelin, who was a very well-known occultist, very into the works of Aleister Crowley. Bought Crowley's house in Boleskine House on the shores of Loch Ness in Scotland, which has a very dubious history, not the sort of place you'd want to spend a night. It burnt to the ground a few years ago in very strange circumstances. But time after time with all these artists, and it's not even just the ones from back in the day, Jimmy Page and Mick Jagger, you know, Katy Perry and Miley Cyrus and all these pop acts that people think of as just bubblegum pop. They're into some very dark stuff, man. Ariana Grande, you know, satanic symbolism everywhere you look in her work. Kesha, all these supposedly bubblegum pop artists now are into some really dark shit.
Yeah, I do remember seeing that meltdown with Britney Spears where she shaved her head and went all weird, and it was clear that she was having a power struggle in her mind about what she was supposed to be doing next. That's how it came across to me, that she was really, really struggling with the situation in her life, and she
that was her mind control programming breaking down. That's what we witnessed there.
She was probably monarch program.
Without a doubt, as so many of them are. So this is a very real thing. Trauma-based mind control programming. It's a whole subject area in itself, but what people will find if they do the research is that so many celebrities and people in the public eye, it can even be politicians and business leaders and newsreaders and television presenters, but they will have undergone this style of programming. And often it's done from a very early age, from very early childhood. When you get into these family bloodlines, again, these people who are specially selected for these public roles by way of the families that they come out of. Within these families, generation after generation, the kids are traumatized and undergo satanic ritual abuse from a very early age to shatter their mind so that they can be programmed with whatever role, with whatever function they're going to be given in the public eye. That's the way they keep all these people on track. That's why they are such great actors, such great musicians and singers, and such convincing public speakers, because they've been programmed to do this. Their mind is literally no longer their own. It's a very real thing. It's a very dark subject, but this is something, again, where you see symbolism pertaining to it all over the place, in pop videos, in movies, in TV shows, in record sleeves. You see monarch butterflies everywhere. This is letting you know that these artists have been subject to this monarch style programming. You see shattered mirrors. You see dolls and teddy bears with limbs missing, with eyes missing. This all pertains to this childhood satanic ritual abuse which goes on, and they're letting you know symbolically right there in public what these people are involved with and what they've been a part of, because they know that for the vast majority of people seeing it, it will go straight over their heads. They'll have no idea what it means. It will go into the subliminal mind, but it won't get properly processed. But when you do the research and when you learn to spot the symbolism, you see that it's everywhere. So all the time they're giving us an opportunity to know what's going on, so that we can never say we were taken by surprise, and we can never make the claim that we weren't told.
Yes, it's outrageously blatant in some cases, like the Kesha video where she's sprawling around on a bed with a great big hexagonal symbol on the wall behind her. And the message in the song is, do what you want. I mean, if you can't get more blatant than that, I don't know what is. So Mark, we're coming towards the end of the hour. I've got to just touch on one subject because we haven't touched on it yet, and that's your cosmology. Why don't you just give people an idea of how that came about when you discovered the globe might not be what it was purported to be?
Yeah, man, happy to. So I embarked on this whole process of questioning everything. it started with the music industry, but I came to realize if you just follow it stage by stage, you realize that the music industry, the entertainment industry as a whole, is a construct. It's all lies, it's all deception, it's all mind control. How can this have been allowed to take place? Well, the only way that it can be like that is if the whole of organized society is founded on lies and deception and mind control and psyops. So when you get into conspiracy research, you come to realize that we're lied to by the establishment about everything. The mainstream media, the government, academic sources that we're entrained to think of as authorities on these subjects. They are all part of the same organization, the same network that wants the masses, us, kept dumb, ignorant of truth, and disempowered and in slavery. So you can follow this through to all kinds of things. And you realize that the world of politics is just a complete farce. We're given these two parties to vote for, but in actual fact, in each case, the politicians involved represent the same parties at the end of the day. We're taught that we have to pay taxes. It's the only way for the economy to thrive. But when you get into what money really is, you realize it's all delusion anyway, because it doesn't exist. It's created out of thin air. And so you can follow this through to all things. And my research took me subject by subject through all these things. And eventually, a few years ago, of course, I came across the idea that the Earth might not be a spinning ball after all, as we've spent our entire lives believing it is. So my first reaction to this was the same as anyone's, I guess. Initially, I just thought that's ridiculous. That can't possibly be true, because it went against an entire lifetime of programming. And but it just wouldn't go away. So I sort of pushed it to the back of my mind, thought that's ridiculous, carried on researching these other things. Then it popped back up on my radar. You know, I would see somebody would send me a video, it would pop up on my Facebook feed, and I think, oh God, that again. Okay, let's have a look at it and see if there's any mileage to it. And gradually, as I gave it another chance each time, because I want to know the truth about things. I always want to know the truth. It doesn't matter how inconvenient it is. It doesn't matter how difficult or unsettling it is. I'm just someone that would always rather know the truth because I don't like lies. So I kept looking at it, and bit by bit, I started to see that the traditional globe model just didn't stack up. So many aspects of it just didn't have any legs, you know. And so I gave it a bit more of my time on each occasion. And I started to look at what people that were proposing that the Earth might actually be a flat motionless plane were saying. And I couldn't deny that they had some very good points and they were making a lot of sense. Contrast that with the traditional model that we're asked to believe in. And you come to realize, if you're going to be truly open-minded about it and truly look at all the evidence for both sides of the argument that's on the table, that the traditional model that we're fed is absolutely preposterous when you come down to it. And if things had been the other way round, if we'd been raised to understand that we live on a flat motionless plane, and we'd spent decades being indoctrinated with that, and then somebody came along at some point and said, oh, actually, this place that we live is a ball with water clinging to the surface around the contours, and it's spinning in 4 different directions at once through the infinite vacuum of space. And yet we don't detect a single aspect of that motion because of this scientific formula or this equation or this piece of scientific jargon that you don't need to concern yourself with. Leave that to the scientists. Just trust them that this is the case. We would tell these people to get the hell out of here, and they're talking absolute garbage. And yet, because it's been the other way round, and we've been entrained our entire lives to believe that we're living on a spinning ball, people just accept that. And so now the alternative explanation gets thrown out as ridiculous by most people. But like I say, when you actually look at what both sides have to offer, the idea that we live on a spinning ball is absolutely, can I swear?
Go for it.
It's absolutely fucking preposterous. The idea that we wouldn't feel any emotion. You know, we're gifted with our senses by the Creator. We have our 5 senses, okay? And they serve us well through our life. They have their purpose. They are used in certain tasks. And yet when it comes to detecting whether there's any motion in the place that we live, our senses let us down and they're completely useless. We might as well not have them. So we're taught that we're spinning in 4 different directions all at once. And it just doesn't compute for me anymore.
Fantastic. Well,
so I've come to conclude that I can't say for definite what this place is where we live, but I can throw out the things that it's not. Well, and as far as I'm concerned, all the scientific evidence, all the logic, all the clues, all the indicators that we have available to us tell us that we're not living on a spinning ball. So that's where I'm at with it.
Fantastic. Well, Roxanne and I are strenuous on sticking to the narrative that the globe is a lie. We can't really declare, is it flat? Is it indeterminate?
Exactly.
Infinite, etc.
I love the title of your event, Globe Lie, because that just sums it all up. We can't say what it is, but we can say what it's not.
100%. And we actually tie the scientists up in knots when we ask them to demonstrate that axial rotation or a molten iron core or a vacuum beside a pressure system. We tie them in knots, just asking for answers to those simple, self-evident truths that we see in front of us. And
that's right.
That's where we need to stay, is challenging the narrative and inviting newcomers in to have a look.
And there's so much emotional attachment to this, as you'll well know, mate. But, it's very curious because you'll meet so many people who declare themselves to be open-minded, critically thinking truth seekers, and they will accept that every other aspect of organized society in terms of what we're told by establishment sources is a lie, it's deception. And yet we've been told the truth about this one aspect, rather important aspect of our cosmology, the very place in which we undergo these physical experiences. Everything else is a lie, but they tell us the truth about this. I think people just cannot stand to admit to themselves and to others that they've been bamboozled and deceived on this one in the worst possible way.
Yeah, and much like you've said, there's deep-rooted subliminals. We've had the Universal Pictures logo was devised as a globe before NASA was even formed. So they were starting it before NASA went up into so-called space. And we've had Star Wars, Star Trek, all this sci-fi film industry giving us our imagination's been working like crazy, seeing the globe as it is. It's a tough one, giving up your globe. So, Mark, we're delighted to have you with us at the Globe Light Convention as a DJ on the Saturday the 14th. Can't wait to see you there. I'm really looking forward to seeing you tonight at Truth Juice in Bristol. Is there any? We haven't really discussed your book, so let's just dive in for a couple of minutes on your book. What's happening with the book? Give people an idea of what they can expect to find in there.
Okay, well, I've got 2 books out at the moment called Musical Truth, Volume 1 and Volume 2, and they bring together everything that I've come to understand about the true nature of the corporate music industry up to the point that I finished the second book. So they're both available on Amazon if anyone wants to get those, but if you don't like Amazon and you prefer to cut them out of the picture and you want to get the books from me direct, all you got to do is send me an email to markdevlinuk@gmail.com, and I can arrange to send out signed copies of the books anywhere in the world. I'm writing another book at the moment, which is a novel. It's going to be called The Cause and the Cure, and it's loaded with allegories and spiritual truths and natural law teachings underneath the surface narrative. I'm really enjoying the process of writing this. It's nearly completed, actually, so I'm looking to hopefully get that out before Christmas. But that's a different departure for me. That's my first forays into the world of writing fiction. Other than that, my YouTube channel is youtube.com/MarkDevlinTV. I've got a whole load of my conference presentations up there. My radio interviews are up on there, a whole bunch of other stuff as well, some Q&A sessions where I answer people's questions about the music industry. What else? Yeah, I'm doing the talk tonight in Bristol, so I'll see you there. And I do public talks at conferences from time to time. When it comes to the Global Eye event in September in Kidderminster, I'm going to be doing a conscious music DJ set, as you say, on the Saturday night. That's me digging into my Sound of Freedom style selection. It's going to be conscious hip-hop, conscious reggae, conscious dance music, where it's all about empowering lyrics and the sentiments of the tracks. It's music that fires you up. It's music that makes you feel good. It's music that communicates a message. And it's all the stuff that you don't hear on the radio.
Yes, and I just want to signpost the an Acapulco set that you kindly gave me, which I'll put in the show notes if that's okay. Sure. Is that a similar set?
Yeah, it's going to be similar to that, yeah.
Okay, and just for those that don't know about an Acapulco, that's probably the world's biggest anarchist symposium. It's probably a month-long event now. Jeff Berwick, who's a Globe denier too, is someone I look up to immensely. He's been running.
I didn't know he was.
He is a Globe denier, and Jeff Berwick came out about 2.5 years ago. He's got his own personal YouTube channel called Jeff Berwick, where he goes out. I never
realised that. That's great.
Yeah. He walks the dog. He interviewed Eric Dubé about 2.5 years ago as well, on Anarchast, his podcast and YouTube podcast. So go back to that one, guys, just to show that there are people out there who've got really quite big followings and influence now, pulling others together. The Anarchast convention is an amazing event. I look forward to maybe one day going to that. It sounds like an amazing event. Did you stay for more than a couple of days when you went?
I was there for about 5 days or so, yeah. It is a great event. As with all events, it had its critics and it had people calling out certain aspects of the organisation and questioning the true nature of it. I think you're going to get that with any event of that scale, of that nature. I can only go by my own personal experience, and I had a great time, met some wonderful people, had some really good conversations, saw some very inspiring talks. So it is a good one to get to. It's expensive to get out there, but treat it as a holiday, save up and treat it as a life experience.
100%. I think he's getting on for 3,000 delegates now in about 3 or 4 years of running, which is quite staggering growth, really. Well, Mark, we want to thank you for carving out an hour with us today and really appreciate you being with us. We'll premiere this on YouTube, so those that are into your work and finding out about you for the first time will have joined in the chat today. Thanks for that. Okay. We'll put all the links to your YouTube channel and social media outlets in the show notes so people can find that there. So is there anything else you'd just like to say before we sign out?
Well, not really. Just look forward to seeing everyone at the conference in September. I don't speak at conferences of this nature because I'm very far from an expert in these subjects.
Sure.
At these type of events, I just like to come along as a delegate and listen to what those people who are far more studied in this subject area than me have to say. I just enjoy absorbing all that information. And I'm just a truth seeker like anyone else, man. I just want the truth.
Fantastic. Well, that's a great place to end, Mark. Thanks once again. We will sign off now with an awesome track by the one and only Isa Michalski. It's called We Don't Love You Anymore, and we should be thinking about the globe when we watch this and listen to this. We'll sign out now. Look after yourself, Mark. Look after yourself, everybody, and yourselves. Take care and see you soon.
All right, thanks.
I don't love you anymore. I might walk right out the door. I don't feel the way I used to about you.